It was a quiet Monday morning in Maple Grove, the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever happens until it does. Rachel Whitmore was sipping her second cup of coffee when she noticed him. A young black teenager standing still at the corner of her street, glancing at his phone, then at a nearby house. He wasn't doing anything, just standing. But that was enough. Rachel's fingers tightened around her mug. Was he scoping the place out? Why wasn't he moving? Her heart started racing. Without thinking, she dialed 911. "There's someone suspicious on Oak Ridge Lane," she whispered. "Young, black, looks about 17. He's just standing there watching the house." "Is he armed?" I don't know. Just send someone, please." 10 minutes later, 2 squad cars pulled up. Officers approached the boy with caution. One of them had his hand on his holster. The boy looked up, startled, and instinctively raised both hands. Inside her house, Rachel watched, her nerves finally calming, until the radio crackled. "Stand down, subject identified. Chief Turner's son. She's en route." Rachel froze. Chief Turner, as in Danielle Turner, head of the FBI's regional office. She dropped her mug, and in that moment, everything began to unravel. Before we dive deeper, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. Stories like this, you won't find them anywhere else. Real, raw, unforgettable. Join a community that dares to feel, to question, to change. Don't just watch. Belong. The next story might change you. Don't miss it. Malik Turner had never liked being the center of attention. He was quiet, observant, the kind of kid who could spend hours dismantling a computer just to see how it worked. At 17, he was already building mobile apps, designing websites, and helping his school's IT department troubleshoot its network. People often said he was going places. What they didn't know was how heavy it felt just trying to stay in one place. Being the son of Danielle Turner, one of the highest-ranking officials in the FBI, came with expectations. His mother had raised him alone, building her career through grit and sacrifice. She believed in discipline, excellence, and the idea that being twice as good was the bare minimum. Malik admired her strength, but often felt like he was walking in her shadow. They lived in a modest but modern home in a predominantly white suburb. A calculated choice by Danielle, who believed proximity to opportunity would open doors for her son. Malik never told her how it felt to be the only black kid in his honors classes, how he pretended not to notice when car doors locked as he walked past, how teachers sometimes looked surprised when he aced a test. Despite the quiet storm inside him, Malik smiled often. He was kind, considerate, and fiercely loyal. He had just been accepted into a competitive summer tech program hosted in one of the city's wealthiest neighborhoods, a chance to meet like-minded teens and build a future. It felt like things were finally starting to shift in his favor. The morning everything happened, he had woken up late. His phone was nearly dead. His charger was missing. He didn't want to call his mom. She had a big press conference that day. So he grabbed his backpack and caught the next bus, arriving just a few minutes after the other students had been let into the house where orientation was being held. He stood on the curb, checking the address again. He knocked once, then tried to text the program coordinator. No answer, so he waited quietly, respectfully, and that's when everything spiraled. Malik had done everything right. But in that moment, to someone watching from a window, he was just a silhouette. A threat, not a teenager with dreams. Malik had always dreamed of creating something that mattered, an app, a platform, maybe even a tech startup one day. Something that would prove he belonged, not just in a classroom or a job, but in a world that too often treated him like an outsider. The summer program was more than just a line on his resume. It was a lifeline, a place where he could finally be surrounded by people who shared his passions, instead of questioning his presence. The orientation was being held at the home of one of the program's coordinators in a wealthy suburb. And although Malik felt a knot in his stomach as he got closer, he reminded himself, "You earned this spot. You belong here." He arrived a little late. No more than 15 minutes, but the gate was already shut. The house was large and quiet, and the front yard was trimmed with precision. Malik hesitated before walking up the driveway. He rang the bell, waited, rang again. Still nothing. So he stepped back to the sidewalk and took out his phone to call the coordinator. No signal. He stood there trying to find a better spot. That's when Rachel Whitmore saw him from across the street. She didn't see his nervous glances or his school-branded backpack. She didn't hear the way he softly mumbled to himself, rehearsing what he'd say once someone opened the door. She only saw what she expected to see. A young black male in an expensive neighborhood standing too long, doing nothing. The 911 call came minutes later. Back at the house, just as Malik was about to leave, 2 patrol cars rolled up, tires crunching softly over the pavement. The officers stepped out quickly. One rested his hand on his gun. The other called out to Malik, "Hands where I can see them." Malik froze. His heart pounded. He didn't understand what was happening. I'm here for the tech program," he stammered. "Put your hands up." The officer repeated. Malik obeyed. He dropped his phone. His backpack was still on his shoulder. The moment felt endless. Him standing there, arms raised, cars parked, neighbors watching. And then, through the police radio, came the voice, "Stand down. That's Chief Turner's son. She's on her way." One of the officers blinked. The other looked away. Rachel, watching from her window, felt her stomach turn. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story. But in a single instant, her assumptions collapsed under the weight of reality. And for Malik, what should have been the first step toward his dream had just become a memory he would never forget. Malik sat on the curb long after the patrol cars drove away. His heart was still racing. The officers hadn't apologized, just nodded and left, as if nothing had happened. One of them even said, "Be careful next time, son." Like the entire encounter had been his fault. He didn't move when the program coordinator, Ms. Rose Stein, finally opened the front door, frantic and apologetic. "I'm so sorry, Malik. I didn't hear the bell. My phone was charging. I had no idea you were out here." Malik forced a smile, shook his head and said, "It's okay." But it wasn't. Inside, the other students were already settled, laptops open, introductions done. Malik found an empty seat in the corner, and while Ms. Stein tried to catch him up, he couldn't focus. His ears still rang with the words, "Hands where I can see them." Jacob Linwood, a boy from his chemistry class, gave him a sympathetic look. "Dude, you okay?" Malik nodded but didn't answer. How could he explain the humiliation of being treated like a suspect before being seen as a student? Later that day, during lunch, Malik heard whispers. One of the students had recorded the police approach from inside the house. It was already on social media, framed as a misunderstanding. But the comments weren't kind. Some called him dramatic. Others said it was standard procedure. One even wrote, "This is why we need neighborhood watch." Malik felt his chest tighten. He had done everything right. Dressed clean, arrived prepared, followed directions. None of it mattered. That night at home, he didn't say much. His mother noticed his silence, but she had just returned from a press conference and looked exhausted. He told her he was fine. She didn't press. He went to his room and locked the door. He stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The worst part wasn't the police or the fear, it was the shame. The quiet voice in his head that whispered, "You'll never really belong." The next morning, he skipped breakfast. When Danielle asked if he was okay, he nodded again. She paused, sensing something, but didn't push. She thought giving him space would help. She didn't know he was already slipping into a spiral of self-doubt and isolation. At the program, Malik withdrew. He participated less, spoke only when spoken to. His project fell behind schedule. Ms. Stein tried to encourage him, but he brushed it off. By the end of the week, Malik had convinced himself of one thing. It didn't matter how smart he was, or how hard he tried. The world had already made up its mind about him, and no amount of talent could change that. Malik stopped looking in mirrors. He avoided them in the hallway at home, in the bathroom at the tech center, even the reflection in his laptop screen. Because every time he caught a glimpse of himself, he didn't see the smart, ambitious kid who used to dream about building software that changed lives. He saw what they saw: a problem. Each day at the program felt heavier than the last. Even when no one said anything, Malik felt the invisible weight of judgment. A teacher smiled too politely. A student offered to explain a concept Malik already knew. A parent waiting at pickup pulled their child slightly closer. None of them said it outright, but he felt it in the space they left between them. And so Malik stopped raising his hand, stopped staying late to finish his code. He submitted a half-finished project, didn't show up for the group meeting. He didn't care, not really, because what was the point? He wasn't just tired, he was done. At home, Danielle started to notice the changes: the half-eaten dinners, the silence during car rides, the lights off in his room at 4 in the afternoon. She tried to talk to him, but he gave her short answers, a fake smile. And she, so consumed by work, by the pressures of being a black woman in power, missed the signs. She thought he was just adjusting, processing. She didn't know he was breaking. Then came the email from Ms. Stein. She wrote with concern, said Malik had missed 2 assignments, that he barely spoke anymore, that he seemed distracted, sad even. She ended with, "I don't want to overstep, but I think something's wrong." Danielle sat at the kitchen table reading it twice, and that's when it hit her. Her son wasn't just quiet, he was drowning. That night, she knocked on his door. No answer. She entered gently. Malik was lying in bed, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. "Hey," she said softly, "can we talk?" He didn't move, didn't blink. She sat beside him, waited. "I don't want to go back," he finally whispered. Danielle took a breath. "To the program, to anywhere," he said. "They all look at me like I'm a threat, even when I smile, even when I don't say a word." Her throat tightened. "You're not a threat, baby." He looked at her, eyes red. "Then why do I feel like one?" There was no anger in his voice, just exhaustion. A deep, aching sadness that Danielle recognized because she had felt it once too. She reached for his hand. "What happened to you wasn't your fault." Malik didn't respond. He didn't need to. Danielle knew that words weren't enough, that even her love, her protection, couldn't erase what the world had just shown her son, that sometimes doing everything right still isn't enough. Over the next week, Malik barely left his room. He skipped the final day of the program, ignored texts from Jacob, turned off his phone. One afternoon, Danielle found his laptop shut, untouched, his notebook still open to a page filled with code, half-finished lines, then scribbles, then just silence. She sat at his desk, staring at the chaos, a quiet grief forming in her chest, because she knew her son wasn't just disappointed, he was disillusioned. The world had cracked something inside him, and she wasn't sure how to piece him back together. If this story is touching something deep inside you, take a moment to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. Maybe you've felt like Malik, or maybe you've been on the other side. Either way, your perspective could help someone else feel seen. It was a Thursday night when Danielle sat down at Malik's door. Not as the FBI's regional director, but simply as his mother. She had been through years of interrogations, courtroom testimony, field operations. She had stared down criminals, bureaucracy, and media storms. But nothing had ever made her feel as helpless as watching her son slip away behind that closed door. This time, she didn't ask to come in. She just started talking. "I was 16 when I got thrown to the ground by 2 officers in broad daylight. They thought I had stolen a purse. I hadn't. I was just walking home from school. Honor roll student. Never even skipped class. But to them, I was just suspicious." She paused. No response. "I didn't tell anyone for years, not even your grandfather. I carried it like a scar that nobody could see. I told myself I had to get tougher, smarter, stronger, And eventually I did. I climbed so high that nobody could touch me, or so I thought. The door creaked open slowly. Malik stood there, arms crossed, face guarded. "You never told me that," he said quietly. "I didn't want you to think the world would always be that cruel." "But it is," he replied, eyes glassy. Danielle nodded. "Sometime, but it doesn't get to define you unless you let it." Malik sat down beside her. For a moment they said nothing. Then he asked, "Why didn't you fight them back then?" "I was scared," she admitted, "and angry. But that moment shaped who I became, not because of what they did, but because of what I chose to do after." He looked at her. "And what was that?" "I decided I'd never be invisible again. And I'd never let another kid like me feel alone." Malik's gaze dropped. Her words settled into him like warmth on a cold floor. He didn't know what to say, but he felt it. Something shifting, not enough to erase the pain, but enough to remind him he wasn't powerless. Later that night he opened his laptop. The code he'd abandoned stared back like a mirror. It was broken, incomplete. Just like him. He didn't fix it, not yet. But he didn't close it either. And for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to wonder, what if this story isn't over yet? The next morning, Malik did something he hadn't done in days. He got out of bed before noon. The house was quiet. Danielle had left early for work, but she'd left a note on the counter. "Proud of you, no matter what. Mom." Beside it, his favorite cereal and a fresh charger for his phone. He smiled just a little. It was the first time in weeks that something felt normal. Later that day, Malik pulled out his notebook and stared at the half-written code. His hands hovered over the keyboard. At first, it felt impossible, like speaking a language he'd forgotten. But then, he typed one line, then another. Slowly, the rhythm returned. It wasn't perfect, but it was movement. It was a spark. He still didn't want to go back to the program. Not yet, but he emailed Ms. Stein, apologized for disappearing, told her he was working on the project at home and hoped to submit it late. Her response was immediate. "Take your time, Malik. I'm just glad to hear from you." A few days later, he opened a message from Jacob. It was simple. "Whenever you're ready to talk, I'm here." Malik stared at the text for a long time. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed to hear that. That weekend, he went for a walk. Not far, just a few blocks around his neighborhood. He kept his hoodie down, his pace calm, his eyes forward. Every car that passed made him flinch, but he didn't turn around. He kept walking. It wasn't about pretending nothing had happened. It was about refusing to let it be the end of the story. When he got home, he sat down with his mum and told her everything. How he'd felt invisible, small, judged. How the police incident wasn't the first time, just the loudest. Danielle listened, no interruptions, no advice, just presence. Afterward she asked, "What do you want to do next?" Malik thought about it, then said, "Finish my project. Not because of the program, because I want to." She smiled. That's all I needed to hear. Over the next few days, Malik rebuilt the app from scratch. He added features he hadn't thought of before. Not flashy, just useful. A tool to help teens report bias incidents anonymously to their schools. It wasn't just code anymore, it was his voice. And for the first time since that morning on the sidewalk, Malik felt like he had something to say again. Submitting the project was easy. Hitting send took 2 seconds, but what came after, that was harder. Malik still felt nervous when his phone buzzed, still hesitated before stepping outside. The world hadn't changed, people hadn't changed. What changed was how he chose to move through it. A week after turning in the app, Miss Stein invited him to speak at the closing event for the summer program. She said his work had sparked conversations among the faculty, conversations about race, bias, and the responsibility schools had to protect all students equally. Malik almost said no. Standing in front of people who had once looked at him like a suspect felt like stepping into fire. But when he told his mom, Danielle simply said, "Do it scared." So he did. The auditorium wasn't huge, but it felt like a stadium. Parents, teachers, students, all waiting. When Malik walked to the podium, a few eyes widened in recognition. He knew some of them remembered the video. The headline, "Suspicious Teen Mistaken for Intruder." He cleared his throat. "My name is Malik Turner," he began, "and for most of my life, I've tried to be the kind of person that makes people comfortable, polite, quiet, smart, safe." He paused. Let that word hang in the air. But one morning, none of that mattered. I stood on a sidewalk, waiting to start something I was proud of. And I ended up with my hands in the air and fear in my chest. Not because of what I did, but because of how I looked. He looked out at the crowd. No one moved. That moment broke something in me. But it also built something. It made me want to understand why fear speaks louder than facts. And it made me realize that silence helps no one. He shared the story of the app, the idea behind it, not just to expose bias, but to help schools respond better when it happens. Not to shame, but to educate. When he finished, the room stayed quiet for a moment longer than expected. Then someone clapped, then more, until it became a standing ovation. Rachel Whitmore was in the back row. She had come at Miss Stein's invitation. She hadn't told Malik she'd be there, but she listened to every word. And when the applause died down, she wiped tears from her eyes. Outside, as people mingled, Rachel approached. "I owe you an apology," she said, voice trembling. "Not just for that day. For everything I assumed before I even saw you." Malik looked at her, thought about all the ways he could respond. Instead, he said, "Thank you for saying that," because forgiveness wasn't forgetting. It was choosing to move forward with eyes wide open. Malik never expected the video of his speech to go viral. He didn't even know it had been recorded until Jacob sent him the link. "Dude, you're everywhere." At first, Malik felt a familiar panic, eyes watching him, people forming opinions. But this time, it was different. The comments weren't cruel. They were thankful. People shared their own stories of being misjudged, mistreated, misunderstood. Some were from teenagers, some from parents, some even from officers who said, "We need to do better." For the first time, Malik's story wasn't a headline of fear. It was a message of change. The following week, his school principal asked him to speak at a staff development day. A local news outlet reached out for an interview. Even Danielle was invited to discuss law enforcement reform in schools, and this time she brought Malik with her. He stood on stages he never imagined, not as a victim, but as a voice. Yet amid the momentum, something deeper shifted, not just in Malik, but in the way people looked at him. Teachers greeted him with genuine warmth. Classmates asked about his app. Jacob invited him to join a student committee on racial awareness. It wasn't about being praised, it was about being seen. Still, the moment that marked real healing came quietly, at home. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon. Malik was helping Danielle sort old boxes in the garage when he found a dusty folder labeled Mom Academy. Inside were photos, notes, and one document that stopped him cold. A complaint form from when she was 16. He held it carefully, like something sacred. "You kept this?" Danielle looked over. "Yeah, I almost threw it away a dozen times." "Why didn't you?" "Because it reminded me why I chose this path. Not to forget where I came from, but to make sure no one else had to carry that alone." Malik nodded slowly. Then he said something he hadn't said in a long time. "I think I want to follow in your footsteps. Not FBI, at least not yet, but maybe law, policy, something that can make things better." Danielle didn't respond right away. She walked over, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've already started." That night, Malik reopened the app. He updated it, cleaned the interface, added a new section, Know Your Rights, a resource hub for teens of color. He wasn't just building tools anymore, he was building bridges. 2 weeks later, the school district adopted his app in 3 pilot campuses. One of the board members said, "This is exactly what we've needed, but we didn't know it until he showed us." Rachel Whitmore volunteered to be part of the parent committee that would help oversee its implementation. During the first meeting, she introduced herself, then looked across the room and said, "I want to thank Malik Turner, not just for this app, but for giving me the chance to be better. After the meeting, she approached him again. I've been reading, listening, learning. My son's starting school next year. I hope he has teachers like you. Malik smiled. So do I. Later that evening, back at home, he and Danielle sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the rooftops. Do you think it'll last? He asked. The change? Danielle thought for a long moment. Real change is slow, she said. It gets pushed back, it gets ignored. But then someone speaks, someone listens, and things shift. One person, one choice at a time. Malik leaned back in his chair. Then I'll keep choosing. He didn't feel small anymore. He didn't feel like a threat. He felt like exactly who he was meant to be. Looking back, Malik often thought about how a single morning could redefine everything. He didn't forget the fear, the humiliation, the quiet rage that followed. But more than that, he remembered the silence that almost swallowed him. How close he came to believing the lie that he didn't belong, how dangerously easy it was to let other people's fear become his truth. But through it all, Malik learned something powerful. Your story doesn't have to end in the place where someone else tried to bury you. He realized that pain, when faced with honesty, could be reshaped into purpose, that his voice, once quiet and hesitant, carried weight, not just in protest, but in creation. He had turned the moment that nearly broke him into a catalyst that connected, educated, and inspired. And perhaps the most profound lesson came not from the applause or recognition, but from the apology. When Rachel Whitmore looked him in the eye and said, "I was wrong," he understood that change doesn't always start with anger. Sometimes it starts with accountability. Malik didn't become fearless. He became intentional. Every decision now carried a new weight. A responsibility to the younger kids watching, to the friends who still felt unseen, and to the version of himself who once stood on that sidewalk waiting for a door that never opened. In the months that followed, Malik's app expanded beyond the pilot schools. A non-profit partnered with him to fund a statewide rollout, and several districts across the country reached out for guidance. He was still just a high school senior, but his voice had grown louder than he ever imagined. Danielle watched her son blossom into a leader, not the kind who shouts to be heard, but the kind who listens first, who shows up, who builds solutions in a world full of noise. Malik chose to study public policy and computer science, determined to bridge the gap between technology and justice. He began mentoring younger students, encouraging them not just to code, but to believe in the power of their own story. You don't have to be perfect, he'd tell them. You just have to be real. Rachel, meanwhile, became an advocate within her own community. She spoke openly about her mistake and how it changed her. Some criticized her, others applauded. But she kept going, not for applause, but because silence had cost too much already. Malik never forgot what happened, but he no longer carried it as a wound. He carried it as a seed, one that had grown into something far greater than he'd ever imagined. How many times have we made a decision based on fear instead of truth? How often do we let a glance, a hoodie, a silence convince us of danger where there is none? Malik's story is not just about one morning or one mistake. It's about what happens when we stop, listen, and choose to see each other fully. It's about what changes when someone stands up, speaks out, and turns pain into purpose. But now, the question is yours. Have you ever judged someone too quickly, assumed something before asking? What would you do if the person you feared was just a kid with a dream? Tell us in the comments, what part of Malik's journey spoke to you the most? Would you have had the courage to forgive or to admit you were wrong? And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, with someone who might think differently because of it. Because real change doesn't come from silence, it comes from choice. And maybe, just maybe, your choice today could be the beginning of someone else's transformation. Subscribe, like, and stay with us.